Welcome to the What Really Happened radio show. Putting America first, second, and third. Here is your host, Michael Rivero.
And aloha, America. Welcome to our show. It's Tuesday, July 30th, 2013, almost into the month of August. The summer is just flying on by. We've got a lot of stuff to talk about today. Phone lines are open, 800-313-9443, 800-313-9443. Manny is sitting in our control room, twiddling the dials, keeping us out of trouble, ready to answer the phone when you call on in. Now, a reminder today in our third hour, Kevin Annett will be our on-air guest talking about this exploding scandal involving Canada's residential schools for Indigenous children. Canada funded these schools. They were run by the Catholic Church of Canada and the Anglican Church of Canada. Record of hideous amounts of abuse. The survivors are finally getting some justice. Obviously, the government of Canada and the churches wanted this thing to be covered up. Kevin has just spent years and years exposing this horrific scandal. I mean, this is far worse than the molesting the altar boys that have sort of come to be associated with organized religion. In this case, there was physical abuse tantamount to torture. Deaths resulted, mass graves. It's an ugly story. We're going to be talking about that in the third hour. Tomorrow, Wednesday, in our third hour, economist Ellen Brown will be our guest talking about her new book and the predations of private central banking on the public of any nation that is enslaved to such banks. So tune in. That's going to be a very, very interesting show. And, of course, Claire will be rejoining us again in the third hour on Friday. Now, I want to thank everybody who sent me emails and messages and tweets concerned about tropical storm, tropical depression Flossie. By the time it got to us here on Oahu, it had pretty much fizzled. We had a little bit of lightning, a little bit of rain, and that was basically it. The expectation greatly outweighed the experience, to put it bluntly. And I feel kind of silly for all the preparations I'd made a few days ago of getting things under cover and whatnot, because it really wasn't necessary. So it turned out to be a non-issue. And kind of like when you see a really good, well-edited movie trailer and you go down to the theater and you're into the first 20 minutes of the movie and realize it's just this horrible non-GMO turkey up there on the screen. We had an unexpected thunderstorm last week that was far more severe. Amazing, spectacular lightning, very, very heavy rain. And it's just a reminder that the people who are insisting they can accurately predict what Earth's temperature will be 100 years from now can't really tell you for certain what's going to happen in the next 24 hours. Just a little reminder about the current state of weather and climate science. Now, a quick mention. Earlier today, I was a guest on Joyce Riley's Power Hour on another radio network we don't need to mention. And she made a point of asking her listeners to call Cumulus Radio and suggest that she and I be replacements for Rush Limbaugh and Sean Hannity, who are supposedly leaving that network end of the year. So on the off chance that somebody from Cumulus is listening to this show, I hope you're enjoying yourself here. And moving right along. Now, obviously, top story right now is the trial of Bradley Manning. He has been, as of the last word, acquitted of the charge of aiding the enemy. But he was convicted on some 19 others, including 5 counts of espionage and 5 counts of theft. And we're getting these stories about this has been a kangaroo trial right from the start. They're trying to make an example out of this guy to just terrorize government workers to never share anything that they're looking at, no matter what. And I understand why they were unable to get a conviction for aiding the enemy, because that entire charge was based on the fact that some of the WikiLeaks documents had been found supposedly in the house at Abbottabad, where they killed that old man and tried to pass him off as Osama bin Laden. And we know that whole situation was a hoax, so anything found in the house is going to be a hoax. And you couldn't rule out the possibility that that old man that they tried to pass off as Osama bin Laden didn't just download the stuff from WikiLeaks. So that charge resulted in acquittal, but they've got him on 19 others, and they're going to make an example out of him. And it's absurd, and I'll tell you why it's absurd. Real spies that harm the national interest, like Jonathan Pollard and Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, stole America's nuclear secrets and gave them to our known enemy, the Soviet Union. What Bradley Manning did was released evidence of U.S. war crimes, innocent civilians being targeted, that kind of material, which is not the same thing. And we have a government that is desperate to keep a lid on all the things they are doing wrong around the world. And Bradley Manning is a whistleblower. He is not a traitor. He is not a spy. He is now a martyr for truth and restoration of the Republic. And by the way, have you noticed what a very poor job both WikiLeaks and Julian Assange did protecting this particular source? It's one of the reasons to suspect WikiLeaks is actually an intelligence front, because they just sort of blossomed into existence instantaneously. And the court, Julian Assange registered the domain WikiLeaks. 3 months later, he was on the cover of Time and Newsweek as the go-to source for whistleblowers in the government. And he hadn't even leaked anything at that point, hadn't even released anything. And he'd been in business for exactly 3 months, and at that time you had other blogs that had been in existence for 10 years that to this day are still ignored by the corporate media. And all of a sudden the corporate media was saying, oh yes, WikiLeaks and Julian Assange, if you're a whistleblower, you should want to go there. And look what happened to Bradley Manning for following that particular advice. Now, Barack Obama is out on the campaign trail. He's not campaigning to be elected to office. He's campaigning to keep his job, as more and more people are openly talking about impeachment here. And he's made his fourth speech in the last week. I think he's down in Tennessee, and he's out there saying, we're going to make the economy work. Forget about all those scandals. I want to focus on making the economy better. Well, Mr. Obama, you've had the job for 5 years now, and I don't think there's anybody listening to this broadcast who thinks you've done a good job of improving the economy for anybody outside of Wall Street. And we don't think you're going to change your stripes at this particular point. He's just trying to create a distraction. They weren't able to get a distraction with Adam Kokesh's planned armed march into Washington, D.C. on July 4th. They weren't able to get a distraction with massive nationwide race riots following the Trayvon Martin, George Zimmerman case. So now Obama's out there saying, yes, believe in me. I will make the economy better for you if you'll just forget all about those phony scandals that I'm being harassed with. It's a vast right-wing conspiracy to bring down my presidency. Mr. Obama, you don't need any help. Now, Representative Issa is out there in Congress as the Congress goes through a tremendous pretense of looking into some of these scandals, and says the evidence is now indicating that the Internal Revenue Service was engaging in activities targeting political dissidents and conservative groups over and above interfering with the application for a 501c4 tax-exempt status. We know that some of Mitt Romney's top donors seem to disproportionately be hit with IRS audits this year. And so that scandal is refusing to go away. And I'll tell you how this is going to play out. More and more Americans are now confronted with the reality that the Internal Revenue Service is operating outside the letter of the law. They are not supposed to be used as a political weapon. Misuse of the IRS for that purpose was one of the articles of impeachment against Richard Milhouse Nixon. And Obama's already in there in full Nixon mode. And now Americans are starting to wonder if all this talk about the income tax itself being illegal and outside the law might be real. So this is a good time to share Aaron Russo's documentary, America from Freedom to Fascism, with anybody who hasn't seen it. We relinked it to the front of whatreallyhappened.com. You might want to take a look at it. And I know in those naive, happy days before Saddam's nuclear weapons, 95% of Americans still believed the government was honorable and legal and serving the public. Now we all know better. And now's the time to come back and look at all those people who have been saying the 16th Amendment wasn't actually ratified. The income tax is a cruel hoax perpetrated on the American public for 100 years. We'll be right back. And aloha, America. Welcome back to the show. And the corporate media is going on and on and on about all these sudden prison breaks. All these militants and terrorists are breaking free. And apparently 250 escaped in Pakistan, 500 in Iraq a week ago, 1,000 a few days ago from Benghazi. And now this 250 from jail in Pakistan. And the corporate media is going on, oh, is this a renewed assault by Al-Qaeda? Are they going to send these people into America to blow up propane factories and set wildfires and stuff? I have an alternative idea. The U.S. is still trying to ramp up terror, 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 terror. And everybody's saying there are no terror attacks. Why is that? Well, the terrorists are all in prison. We've got them in Pakistan, in Benghazi, and Iraq, and Guantanamo. They're going down in the White House Situation Room. They're going down the list of who they can get to replace Osama bin Laden. How about this guy? He's in jail. How about this guy? He's in jail. How about that guy? He's dead. It's like a scene out of the movie Canadian Bacon. And so somebody said, if we're going to have a credible terrorist threat, some of these terrorists we've thrown in prison have to somehow get out. And it does seem rather odd that we're seeing this vast number of jihadis and evil Arab Muslims breaking out of jail with the use of military weapons, I might add. And it's not inconceivable that governments would do that. Remember when the invasion of Iraq was just getting cranked up, when they had to just teach Iraq a lesson about selling their oil for the euro. 2 British SAS officers were caught driving an unmarked car, and in the car were explosives and Arabic clothing. And they were arrested on suspicion of terrorism, and the British Army literally attacked and destroyed the police station to get these 2 guys back before they could be questioned. So these sorts of things do go on all the time. But now there's all these recently jailbroken terrorists running around, and the government can say, oh, you've got to be afraid of terrorism again. And it is not working, because there have been several polls ever since the NSA Gate story broke, and the latest one by Pew Research that says Americans are far more concerned about the threat from the U.S. government than from terrorism. As well as they should be, because last year, according to the U.S. government itself, 2012, only 10 Americans were killed by acts of terror, and none of them inside the United States of America. According to Richard Barrett, who's the coordinator of the UN Al-Qaeda Taliban monitoring team, the odds of dying inside the United States from a terrorist attack are 20 million to 1 against. You are far more likely to be accidentally shot by a police officer. You are far more likely, thousands of times more likely, to be killed by a mistake made by your doctor or pharmacist. The terror threat just isn't there. It's all theater. We're having a theater production called 9/11 with spectacular special effects to sell you the next war. Now, as I mentioned earlier in the show, referred to it, there's been a huge explosion down in Florida at a propane processing refilling facility. And the fire got out of control, and all those little tiny propane tanks for barbecues were exploding. They're already out there saying, no, it wasn't a crime, wasn't terror, just some money junkie cut the safety systems too close, and the things went bang. Now, over in Pakistan, they finally have a new president. Pakistan lawmakers have elected Mamnoon Hussain as their candidate for the ruling party. And it looks like the current leadership is on its way out because they have not exactly endeared themselves to the Pakistani people by turning a blind eye to all these drone strikes by the United States into Pakistan territory, which average about 50 completely innocent, blameless bystanders for every one guy they think might be a terrorist. They're not sure, but he dresses funny, so let's kill him anyway. Now, over in Ireland, the public upset at their economic problems is continuing to grow, and the Irish people are basically starting to form around two ideas: dumping the euro and an end to austerity. Now remember, Wall Street, despite all these cash reserves they're building up with this quantitative easing, does not have the cash to cover the credit default swaps sold against Europe's debt. If Europe starts to come apart, there's going to be a firestorm on Wall Street, people pounding on the doors, seeking payment on those credit default swaps they bought. And I want to comment a little bit about the word austerity. it's misused a very great deal. When you yourself voluntarily choose to simplify your lifestyle, that's austerity. When the government comes in and says you must make do with less so we can have more, that's dictatorship. That's tyranny. That's oppression. That's not austerity. Austerity is a voluntary thing. And I don't think the people of Ireland, and certainly not the people of the United States of America, after a lifetime of trying to build their businesses and careers, that they're going to say, yes, I'm going to give up all that expectation of a higher standard of living that I spent my life working for, so the federal government can take more money to give to Wall Street to prop them up a little while longer. Now, over in Great Britain, there's a very alarming trend called the zero-hour job, or the zero-hour contract. And apparently this is sweeping through Britain's retail establishment, where they will hire part-time workers with no guarantee of how much hours they're going to get. And, of course, no holiday, no sick time. You're basically sitting there at your phone waiting to be called and said, please come in and work 2 hours. Please come in and work 3 hours. Even film extras aren't treated that shabbily. And it's a trend we've been seeing from any nation where the money junkies are in charge, where workers are just disposable assets. Bring them in, get the work out of them, kick them back out again. It's a very alarming trend. And now, of course, we know that everyone's talking about minimum wage. And it's now become a joke. You cannot live in the United States of America on the current mandated minimum wage. It just can't be done. Remember that budget that McDonald's helpfully put together for their employees on how they could live on the pay they're getting from McDonald's? And the budget only worked if they had a second job. That's the new philosophy for the American worker. You know, work 80 hours a week, drop dead when you're no longer of any use. That's work them till they're dropped. Fascism on display here. Now, Nancy Pelosi is now championing a new cause. She wants to free parents from the burden of child care. You don't want to spend all that time nurturing your own child and teaching him at home. We, the state, will do it for you. You men have to go off to work at 2 jobs. You women, as soon as you pop that little rugrat out, you should go off back to your 2 to 3 part-time jobs a week. We, the state, will take over the nurturing and training of your child. How very Prussian of her to be saying so. All righty, let us see. Going on here. Over in Detroit, I'm going to tell you how bad it is. I was actually joking with Claire the other day about how Detroit will actually pay you to move there and take over some of these abandoned homes on the condition, of course, that you maintain it and not let it deteriorate anymore. And it sounds initially attractive until you realize what Detroit has become. Average wait time for a police call there is running close to an hour. But apparently one Detroit family put their home on the market for $1. After 519 days, nobody has come in and said, we'll go for that deal. Got to take a break for commercials. We'll be right back. And aloha, America. Welcome back to the show here. And the corporate media is all a Twitter, and I guess Twitter's all a media, about the upcoming movie on Hillary Clinton, just in time for the 2016 campaign. I don't think I'm going to go see it. I'm getting sick and tired of monster movies. I think they've had their day. They're filming the new Godzilla here on Hawaii right now. It's all supposed to be hush-hush, which means everybody on the island knows. I want to step back to this Bradley Manning situation. I know we're all delighted he was acquitted on this charge of aiding the enemy, specifically Al-Qaeda, because some of the material he leaked to WikiLeaks was found with the old guy they killed and tried to pass off as Osama bin Laden. But in looking around, let me read you some actual headlines from the corporate media. Talk about aiding the enemy. British forces and Al-Qaeda fighters side by side in Libya. Shock. America fighting on the side of Al-Qaeda in Libya. U.S. fighting alongside Al-Qaeda rebels. Libyan rebels meet White House officials. Libyan rebels seek funds in White House meeting. Libyan rebel leader says his fighters have Al-Qaeda ties. U.S. arms for Al-Qaeda in Syria seized in Lebanon. U.S. and Al-Qaeda in full agreement on Syria. U.S. says it can use Al-Qaeda in Syria temporarily. CIA sending arms to Al-Qaeda rebels in Syria. Are we seeing a pattern here? Now, Bradley Manning, unlike the U.S. government, did not intend to aid al-Qaeda against the United States. Bradley Manning and Edward Snowden and Russell Tice and all of them intended to bring to light wrongdoing by the United States government to keep that government answerable to the American people and to international law. That's why they're slapping Bradley Manning around in that courtroom. That's why they're going to do the same thing to Snowden when they get him back. Because they blew the whistle. This government has broken free of the Constitution. It's committing international crimes, crimes against humanity. It's fomenting war against innocent nations, and they just don't want you to know about it. It makes them so sad when you find out what they're really doing, because they rely on you believing that they're the good guys to get your tax money, to get your obedience, to get your children for more wars. And they're very unhappy. And that's why Bradley Manning's being slapped around. Now, getting back to the economic news, J.P. Morgan is now accused by the United States government, which is struggling to try and prove it's actually doing its job to keep Wall Street under control. So J.P. Morgan is now accused of manipulating the electricity market. In other words, when Enron collapsed and laid waste to their employees' pension plans, to all of their investors, to all their customers, huge amounts of damage, and all of a sudden J.P. Morgan said, wow, there's now a vacuum. There's nobody out there screwing the public by manipulating electricity. There's a revenue opportunity for us to get into. And J.P. Morgan went right back into California where Enron had been and just sort of picked up the wires, plugged them back in, and started using the same games Enron had done, which are illegal, I might point out, to screw the people of California and across the Midwest out of more money for their electricity, to boost profits. Now, J.P. Morgan's response is they will neither admit or deny anything. They are going to pay a $410 million fine, which sounds like a lot of money. Certainly sounds like a lot of money to me. Sounds like a lot of money to you. To a company like J.P. Morgan, they're going to take that out of the coffee fund and get away with it. Have you noticed that the U.S. government bolsters its reputation with the public by playing firefighter? They're going to wait until something burns down or is almost burned down. Then they'll rush in with their hoses and they'll spray it with water and they'll chop it up with axes and give the country, give the people back maybe 1/2, 1/3 of what they had before and pose as a hero. That's not the function of the government. The function of the government is to be that person who goes into that garage 2 weeks earlier and says, can we repair that frayed wiring sitting next to that pile of oil-soaked rags? That's what government is supposed to do in its best, most proper form, is prevent these crimes and disasters from happening in the first place. Not hope something goes really bang so they can act like a hero and go in and look good for the corporate media cameras here. We're going to take a phone call here. Bill in Texas. Aloha. Bill, welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
My mother, I should say I'm a half-breed. My mother is a full-blooded Indian, and in the early 40s, she was in Indian school in Oklahoma. And if you spoke your native tongue, they would make you put your hand on your desk and beat it with one of those wooden rulers with the metal edge.
Yes.
And if you continued to be bad, they actually had a cooler, like a little box they would put you in.
Yes, the box of shame. No,
and that's. Oh, I'm sorry.
That definitely was being done, and I don't mean to ignore and gloss over what was being done all over the Native American lands by all governments. It's just that this one up in Canada is coming to light now and appears to have been some of the worst of the abuses. There's a movie out, it's actually been out for a while, but it's making the rounds on cable again, called The Last of the Dogmen. It's a very charming, romantic story about how there are still surviving Cheyenne warriors up in the wilds of, it's either Montana or North Dakota. But there is a very short expose in there about how Native American children were being integrated into the European society by forcing them to change their hair, change their dress, not use their own language. It is something that has been a major abuse in our history, not even just our history. Over in Japan, when the samurai were being taken down from power, they were forbidden from wearing that little special hair knot that signified they were samurai. It's all about erasing the other culture to cement the supremacy of the invading culture. We saw it here in Hawaii when the United States usurped the Hawaiian throne and illegally, and the U.S. government admits they were illegal to do so, illegally annexed Hawaii. The first thing the annexing party did was they went over to Iolani Palace, which is the only royal palace still standing on U.S. territory, and they literally stripped it bare. They took everything, all the furniture, all the decorations, all of the plaques and everything, and just got rid of it, scattered it to the four winds to erase the cultural identity. When the Iolani Palace Foundation, the Friends of Iolani Palace, started to restore the palace, they found one of the tables from the king's bedroom in a thrift shop, sitting there with like a $5 sticker on it. And this was just a piece of history that was there. And so it is something that invading, conquering powers tend to do. And they certainly did it to the Native Americans. The Israelis are doing it to the Palestinians today. And it's just part of the, marking my turf. I'm going to come in, tear down your monuments, put up my monuments. The early Christianity would build their churches over pagan temples to erase them. Early Christianity actually stole a lot of their rituals and holidays from the religions that were being suppressed. That's why Christmas wound up in the dead of winter instead of early spring, which is when the lambs are in fact being born. The sign of making the cross was taken from Mithraic tradition. The original Christians had their holy day on the seventh day of the week, which is Saturday. And they moved it over the Sunday to overwrite that part of Mithraic tradition. So, yeah, this gets done throughout history, doesn't make it right, and doesn't make it more forgivable. My
grandmother would not take anything from the U.S. government.
She was very wise.
She wouldn't take no Social Security, no help, and anything. Anyway, that's all I had, and keep up the good work, and thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much for the phone call. And yes, these abuses have gone on throughout history, but you know something? I know that Israel today tries to justify what it's doing to Palestine by pointing out how the U.S. behaved against the Native Americans back in the 1800s. But you know something? None of us were alive in the 1800s. Can't do a thing about it. We can say it was wrong, but two wrongs don't make a right. What is going on in Palestine today is something we can do something about if we find it morally objectionable, and we ought to. And we ought to do something about it. The reason the Canadian residential school scandal is current is because the survivors of that abuse are alive today and seeking recognition and justice for what was done to them. All right. Now, speaking of injustice, apparently over in the Los Angeles Police Department, boy, you'd think after all the media coverage they're getting, they'd sort of tone things down here a little bit. But apparently there was this gentleman who was riding his bicycle at night without the required lights, little headlamp, a little flasher on the rear, and got into a confrontation with the Los Angeles Police Department, who wound up literally throwing him on the ground and stomping on him for not having lights on his bicycle. Whatever happened to the days when police officers went after robbers and rapists and murderers and real criminals? Aloha, America. Welcome back to the show. And up in Oakland, California, you probably remember them. That's where the Occupy movement was having a peaceful protest against the financial predations of the Federal Reserve and Wall Street, and the Oakland police were shooting tear gas canisters at the actual protesters. Not just the gas, the actual metal can was being fired. They hit this one war veteran in the head, gave him permanent brain damage. Those people, swell bunch of to protect and to serve type people. Well, the city of Oakland is now considering a new law that would ban any object that could be used as a tool of vandalism at any future protests. This includes things like the stick on a protest sign. It includes photographers' monopods. includes your walking stick if you are aged and infirm. In fact, if you show up there in a pair of crutches, they're probably going to take those away. If you want to express your First Amendment right to freedom of speech, you crawl on the sidewalk. Makes it easier for us to put our boot in your face. And it is another sign of just how afraid the ruling elite truly are of the American people. They want you standing around in your little caged-in First Amendment free speech zone, naked. Nothing on your person that you might fling at them. Wind up flinging poo at them like the monkeys over at the zoo. All righty. Apparently, Pamela Geller, who is out there spewing hate against Muslims, left and right, has reached a point of extremism where even a lot of Jewish people are just fed up with her. And apparently there were these synagogues where she was supposed to speak on her Muslim spewing, and they decided, actually, that's not an appropriate use for our venue. And Pamela Geller came back screaming, I have a First Amendment right to freedom of speech here. Have you ever noticed when it's the Muslims saying Israel's picking on us, it's anti-Semitism, but when it's Israel screaming all Muslims are bad, it's First Amendment freedom of speech? Kind of a little weird dichotomy there. But you need to understand something about the First Amendment. The First Amendment gives you a right to stand in any public venue and voice your opinion without fear of retribution by those that you offend. And in this politically correct era, it is impossible to say anything without some loser somewhere deciding they're going to be offended to grant themselves the illusion of empowerment in their otherwise drab, wretched, and meaningless lives. But that's what the First Amendment says you can do. You can get out on a public street, public park, public buildings and say, I think the government is doing something wrong. And they can't touch you. Well, they're not supposed to. They're doing it anyway, but they're not supposed to. That's the First Amendment. The First Amendment does not give you the right to march into private property, whether it is a church, a synagogue, your neighbor's living room, the local shopping mall, and scream whatever it is you're screaming about there. There is a line. I get that argument all the time here at whatreallyhappened.com when people want to post stories about chemtrails and HAARP and fake Apollo moon landings, and when I delete the stories, they come back and say, you're violating my First Amendment right to freedom of speech. No, I'm not. Start your own website. Go back to your taco stand. Back when the internet was being flooded with really obscene, badly made, gross, disgusting, intending to offend pornography leading up to the introduction of the Exxon Amendment in Congress, and it was pouring into these groups in Usenet that had nothing to do with porn, cooking groups, macrame groups, stuff like that. And the members in those groups would say, you know, there's that whole alt hierarchy where that kind of stuff can go, and the posters kept saying, I have a First Amendment right to come in here and post this stuff if I want. And no, they never did. Because the individual news groups in Usenet were not public spaces. And eventually all the IPs that were pouring all this porn into the net tracked back to government and military servers anyway, so we knew it was a propaganda hoax. But apparently even some Jewish organizations have just had it with Pamela Geller. I guess they're tired of her drool flinging on them as she's up there ranting and raving here. Very interesting story coming out of Israel. Apparently, Rabbi Nissim Karelitz is saying that because cell phones aren't really considered kosher, that if somebody loses one and you find it, you are not required to return it to the owner. You can just keep it and use it, finder's keeper. And it's not a violation of the commandment, thou shalt not steal. I don't know why somebody would want somebody else. What if the person who lost it is Jewish? There's a wrinkle I don't think the good rabbi was thinking about. Israel is now asking the United States to advance future military aid. Israel officially gets about $3 billion of U.S. military aid every year, all of it illegal under the Symington Amendment to the Foreign Appropriations Act, all of it illegal under the Glenn Act. And still that's not enough. They want a future advance. They want $5 billion now that will sort of come out of future aid payments, which is kind of weird. Israel obviously is absolutely convinced that that $3 billion plus a year is going to go on forever, and there's no reason to even begin to suspect that in this harsh economic reality of the United States that Congress would ever dare cut that money back. And they're probably right. But now they want an advance. They want $5 billion now, and they'll pay it back somewhere down the road, maybe. Interesting story coming out of Great Britain, where the government is now starting to prosecute people for posting abusive electronic messages. And apparently under the Communications Act of 2003, a person is guilty of an offense if they send a message or other matter that is grossly offensive or of an indecent, obscene, or menacing character by means of an electronic communications network. Now, we all know that cyber stalking and cyber harassment is a reality. And certainly anybody who's at the forefront of the independent media gets a lot of that stuff every single day, and after a while you just ignore it. But again, this law has the potential for abuse because in our politically correct world, no matter what you say, there is going to be somebody somewhere who will find it offensive as a means to creating the illusion of personal empowerment. And I'll give you a good example. Apparently there was a crossword puzzle in a newspaper that was seeking a three-letter word beginning with J. The clue given was Shylock. And so the ADL, which makes all its money screaming about anti-Semitism, just said, "You will apologize! You're reinforcing, unfair stereotypes of Jews." Well, nobody would really care. If the ADL wasn't making a stink, nobody would even think about, is it an unfair stereotype? It's Shakespeare. And when Shakespeare wrote that, that was the perceived reality. And by the way, I don't know if you've noticed this or not. A lot of high schools and colleges do Shakespeare in their theater department. Hardly any of them do The Merchant of Venice any longer. There was actually a move, I think it was 2 years ago, to rewrite The Merchant of Venice, to change William Shakespeare's original play to be politically correct and not be offensive to Jews. Okay? That's like rewriting Superman to make Lex Luthor less offensive to bald-headed guys. And the ADL gets all this funding. They're fanning this up. Oh, there's Nazis, there's anti-Semitism. Give me money, donate, I will fight it for you. Do you realize that if it ever became realized that anti-Semitism isn't a real problem, it's just opposition to Israel's government policies, ADL would go out of business. Abe Foxman would have to get a real job. And that's why he's screaming about crossword puzzles. Keep the hoax going. Fan it up. We have to create the crisis and then sell people the solution. It's the Hegelian dialectic. Once you're aware that this is out there, you begin to realize how many so-called activist and charity groups are out there creating a crisis out of thin air in order to raise funds to provide a solution. Human-caused global warming being one of the most obvious and well-known these days. All right, we're coming up here on the top of the hour. A reminder that Kevin Annette will be joining with us in our third hour to talk about that. When we come back from this next news break and station identification, back into NSA Gate, computer security. America, welcome back to the show. Hour number 2. The phone lines are open, 800-313-9443, 800-313-9443. I'm checking in with the corporate media, and they're going on and on about Bradley Manning's verdict, and apparently the portion of the espionage law that he was actually charged under is one that has not actually been used since 1917, so they were really scraping the bottom of the barrel to find something they could go after him with, because he didn't steal classified military weapons technology or plans or intentions and give them to our avowed enemies directly. He leaked evidence of U.S. war crimes. And that's what the U.S. is punishing him for. And, of course, now they're back to Obama, who's around there making speeches all over the country saying, if you'll forget all about Floodgate, I'll rig the financial reports to make the economy look better. I promise I'll do that. Now, getting on to NSA Gate. And again, that latest Pew Research poll shows that Americans are far more concerned about government spying on them than they are the threat of terrorism, which is reasonable considering that according to the U.S. government's own figures, no Americans inside the United States died from a terror attack in the year 2012, and only 10 died from terror attacks outside, which from the people carrying those attacks out, they probably weren't thinking I'm a terrorist. They probably were thinking I'm a freedom fighter trying to keep these invaders from coming into my home. Because whether somebody is a terrorist or a freedom fighter depends on which direction they're pointed. Now, we're seeing this article over, this was translated from Germany, from Spiegel, and they're reporting on the revelation that there is a backdoor into the Windows computer system that will allow the NSA to completely bypass SSL encryption, meaning it is not safe any longer. And what we know now, what we have known for quite some time, is the government, urged by the National Security Agency, mandates encryption standards for everybody. Why do they have standards? To make sure they can read your encrypted traffic. Because remember what I've been telling you all along. Decoding an encrypted message is a two-step process. First, they have to find the method. Then they have to find the key for a particular message. Of the two stages, the first one, finding the method, is the hard part. During World War II, the Allies did not break the German Enigma code until they captured a physical machine off of a submarine. They made a movie about it, U-571, which was actually on the air just a few days ago. And it's a highly romanticized story. Makes it look like it was an American operation. It wasn't. It was the British who captured that submarine. And, yeah, Hollywood, you know. But the reality is they weren't able to break Enigma until they captured a physical machine, and from that were able to get the method. Then they built this giant mechanical calculator at Bletchley Park that was able to brute force the keys. So real criminals and real terrorists who have the resources to develop their own encryption systems, they're safe. NSA is not going to find them. We already proved that twice with our NSA challenges we ran off of our website. And that means all this NSA spying and this enforcing of encryption standards on ordinary people is to keep watch on law-abiding citizens. And as we have documented numerous times, government cannot be trusted with your private data. They can find your dirty little secrets to blackmail you with, coerce you to make decisions certain ways. Oh, you don't want to hire this highly qualified employee for your business. We've got the cousin of one of our NSA workers who just got out of college, and yes, he got a 2.9 GPA, and he's a lazy lout, but you want to hire him into that job. Real mafia stuff. And, of course, there's the Seattle APEC, where they were looting business secrets from conference attendees to give to cronies. So this government provably cannot be trusted with your private data. Whether it's your new business plan or your aunt's top secret chocolate chip cookie recipe, this government cannot be trusted with it. And they mandate encryption standards to make sure they can always peek at what you're doing. And it works only against law-abiding citizens who use those encryption standards. For the real criminals and the real terrorists, it's like the gun laws. They're going to ignore the mandated encryption standards, just like they're going to ignore gun registration or gun bans. This is targeted on you, the law-abiding citizen. And apparently with this Windows backdoor being reported in Der Spiegel, the NSA can basically monitor all your banking transactions if they haven't backdoored the banks themselves. And at this point, assume there's a backdoor everywhere. Backdoor in car, backdoor in insulin pumps, backdoors in pacemakers, backdoors in routers, all of it. Story coming out of WCCF Tech on how the NSA has probably planted permanent backdoors inside the actual computer chips in your computers, in Intel and AMD. Where are a lot of those chips being made now? Israel. Now, there's a story going on about how U.S. students were able to fake a GPS signal and use it to take control of a super yacht in the Mediterranean. It's not made clear whether the owners and operators of the yacht knew it was being done, but they were basically able to overwhelm the GPS satellite signal, because it's rather weak when it gets down to the surface of the Earth, and send bogus GPS positioning information to take the yacht off course. As I recall, this was a key part of the storyline of the James Bond movie The World Is Not Enough, spoofing the GPS. It's also thought that the Iranians were able to hijack one of the U.S. drones over their soil by spoofing the GPS as well. But it can be done. Maybe it's time to go back to learning how to use a sextant and a compass and binoculars. But it opens up the possibility that similar systems could be developed by students, by hobbyists, to GPS spoof drones, which rely on GPS for their navigation, to go where they're going to go. Story from TheVerge.com, NASA has now moved a lot of its data storage over to the cloud. And apparently, according to NASA's Inspector General, the move to the cloud has opened up major security gaps in order to protect their data. Now, NASA's data includes a lot of stuff that NASA does for the Department of Defense, and they want to keep an eye on that. But the cloud is not secure. And more companies and agencies are finding that. Now, no doubt here in the United States of America, participation in the cloud is being mandated for various corporations and agencies. They may even mandate it for ordinary citizens, because those cloud companies are starting to already lose customers, especially in Europe. Speaking of NASA and space, you've probably been hearing over the last couple of months about Comet Ison, the comet of the century, and they've been building it up for a long time. And now, apparently, the latest photos are showing that it is not brightening the way it was expected. And now they're saying it may not be as spectacular as they were hoping it was going to be. And, of course, a lot of astronomers got a lot of press out of saying it'll be the comet of the century. Anyway. Now then, speaking of scientists seeking media coverage and fame, 15 minutes of fame for saying outlandish things, over at the National Geographic, which when I was a kid was considered a well-respected, authoritative source on what was going on in the world, but lately they've just gone down the dark path, promoting whatever the latest hokum is from the government. And they have an article on, will Earth's ocean boil away? And the obvious answer is yes, as the sun gets warmer, the oceans could boil away. But then the article spins off and says, human-caused global warming could boil away the Earth's oceans. And National Geographic just lost all their credibility on that one. I'll explain when we come back. Aloha, America. Welcome back to the show. And we're talking about this article that came out in the National Geographic on how eventually the Earth's oceans will boil away as the sun gets warmer and brighter, which, yes, we know that is what's going to happen. And then they spin off and say that human-caused global warming could cause the oceans to boil away more quickly. Horror and horror. Well, this is on the same level as the claim made by the former head of Greenpeace that Greenland was going to lose its entire ice cap in 20 years. That was 10 years ago. Greenland still has all of its ice. In fact, it has a little bit more. When you look at the volume of the Earth's oceans, the amount of energy necessary to boil it all away is far greater than humankind technology is even capable of. Now, let me ask you a question. What happens when you boil away the Earth's ocean, even just a part of it? It becomes water vapor. It goes up in the atmosphere. It forms clouds. It doesn't just go off into space. It goes up into the atmosphere. And it does so without the salt. Now, in a world where fresh water is already being warred over, warming the Earth's ocean to increase evaporation and increase freshwater rain sounds like a really good thing to me. But apparently, whoever it is who's working over at the National Geographic isn't thinking very clearly, if they're thinking at all. And I have a question for the people over at the National Geographic. How many active underwater volcanoes and thermal vents are there on the floors of the world's oceans? And don't be embarrassed if you don't know the answer, because it's a trick question. Nobody knows. Nobody actually knows how many active underwater volcanoes there are on the floors of the world's oceans, how many thermal vents there are. So nobody knows how much heat is being released from those volcanoes and thermal vents into the ocean. And therefore, anybody who comes along and says, I calculate that human contributions to ocean warming are thus and such, is smoking opium, because they can't subtract out the temperature contribution from an unknown number of active volcanoes. Remember the El Nino current? They were making a big deal about that a while back. Oh, it's a sign of human impact on the climate. The El Nino current just comes out of nowhere and screws up the weather patterns. And then they discovered that the El Nino current is actually caused by a chain of underwater active volcanoes on the floor of the ocean where that current originates. So they're just guessing about all this stuff. And like I said, Flossie was a fizzle here on Oahu. It was all over the news, biggest storm since Aniki, and there was a little lightning and a little rain, not even up to the thunderstorm we had a week ago. And yet these same weather climate scientists are insisting they can tell us exactly how much warmer the Earth will be 100 years from now, and who to blame for it, meaning you. And the National Geographic used to be considered an authoritative source on what was going on in natural history around the world. And we know they've been tied in with the government for a long, long time. National Geographic's mapping division got the contract to provide maps to the U.S. military for World War II. A lot of intelligence agents are covered as National Geographic reporters and photographers, and it's a great cover. You go into somebody else's country, and you say, I'm from National Geographic, I'm a photographer, and the government there will say, great, glad to have you here. Let me show you this. Let me show you that. Take some pictures of this thing we're building. And it's a great cover. But lately, the National Geographic has gone a little too far into political correctness and pushing the global warming hysteria, and they're embarrassing themselves. And remember back in, I think it was 2009, when they were trying to fan up, the new bird flu, the new pig flu, the when pigs fly flu. It was going to be a pandemic. It was a pandemic only because the World Health Organization lowered the threshold for what constituted a pandemic. And they got rich selling vaccines that wound up not being used and instead got poured down the drain, which means it's in the city water supply now. And the pandemic never happened. The pig flu turned out to be less damaging than the ordinary seasonal flu. And National Geographic, even back then, I remember they had it on the cover, these circles about the great flu pandemics, including the 1918 Spanish flu, which was misnamed because it actually erupted first in the United States at a military base. And they had the biggest circle of all is what this next flu will do to the human population. And so National Geographic's out there. They've stopped being a journal about natural science and history, and they're just another propaganda rag. They really, really are. Now, speaking of the environment, and something that we don't see a lot of hue and cry about from the environmentalists, who will always scream about your SUV and you're using paper bags and how you're not properly recycling. But there's a lot of things they don't spend a lot of time talking about, like fracking and leaking from radioactive facilities like Hanford, not to mention Fukushima. And apparently there is a growing problem up in the Great Lakes, which represent like the largest freshwater resource on Earth. I think 1/5 of the planet's fresh water is in the Great Lakes. And a lot of stuff gets dumped in there. And apparently there's a growing problem with these ultra tiny plastic particles that are being found in the Great Lakes, and they're starting to become a problem everywhere because fish and birds are ingesting these things. It's making the birds and fish sick and die. And it turns out these little microscopic plastic particles are perfectly round. They are the microbeads used in personal care products like facial scrubs, body washes, toothpaste. And you put it on your body, you wash it down the drain, it gets dumped in the Great Lakes, and the stuff is not biodegradable, and it's apparently building up a burden of these particles. And you're not seeing the people screaming about global warming and they want a carbon tax. They don't pay attention to this stuff. Now that I've said it, they'll probably come back and they'll want a microbead tax. If you're using a product with microbeads, you have to pay a tax for the eventual cleanup of the microbeads. Well, I have a better idea. Don't put the beads in there, or put something in there that dissolves over time, like salt. You ever think about that? You can have salt in an oil-based cleanser product, and it's not going to dissolve until the water starts to hit it, and then it dissolves completely. And salt in the ocean doesn't seem to be a problem for most people. There's nothing you can really do about it. Meanwhile, in response to all of this negative information coming out about genetically modified crops, Monsanto, Dow, and other biotech firms have put together a consortium to launch their own advocacy website and media campaign. GMO is your friend. GMO loves you. GMO will save the world. And they're hoping to basically put this out here to counter all the negative information that's coming out, like the French study on the rats. And now the Russians are repeating that same study for confirmation. And then going to be coming out there about how the Roundup-ready crops don't have to have weed killer sprayed on them. Well, maybe for the first season. But very quickly, the weeds adapt to the glyphosate exposure. And you're not getting more food from GMO crops, you get less. Both because the GMO versions simply don't have the same yields, because the GMO versions are far more susceptible to conditions of drought and disease. They're very fragile. They work great if you're in a laboratory, but farms are not laboratories. Farms are the real world. Farms are nature. And rather than fix the problem with their product, they're just going to mount a propaganda war to convince us that GMO is your friend. You can trust American corporations. We would never do anything wrong. And if you can't trust the people who gave us Agent Orange, who can you trust? We'll be right back. Aloha, America. Welcome back to the show here. Now, we have been talking about the problems with America's medical industrial complex, about how it's just completely geared to making money, to selling products that treat symptoms but never the disease. It's an institution that cannot survive unless the American people are constantly, chronically ill from the after effects of other medications, from chemicals in our food like monosodium glutamate and aspartame. And just unconsciously, we have evolved to a society in which people are allowed to be ill or poisoned by products because now it's a revenue opportunity. Give you a pill for what we are telling you is wrong with you. Even though you felt great before, here's a pill because, our lab instrument says something is wrong with you. Oh, you get a side effect from that pill? Here's another pill. Oh, that one made you sick? Here's some tonic. That one made you sick? All right, well, we'll give you a shot. And it goes on and on and on. Don't forget, it wasn't too long ago that over in Europe, there was a court ruling that established that vaccines, the MMR, measles, mumps, rubella vaccines, and thimerosal, mercury-based preservatives, were causing autism and brain damage. And there was a growing outcry regarding these abuses by the vaccine companies that was brought to a halt with the Homeland Security Act. Most people don't remember this, but when the Homeland Security Act was passed, that created the Department of Homeland Security, which is now a de facto national police department, there was a rider in that bill that granted blanket immunity to the manufacturers of vaccines. You can't sue them no matter what they pump into your kid's arm, because having a supply of vaccines at hand is critical to defending the nation from biological terror attack. And so because legal costs and settlements could not be acquired, interest in pursuing the lines of investigation into thimerosal pretty much collapsed at that point. But we have seen all these documented cases of children that are immediately negatively affected by vaccines. Been a lot of cases involving Gardasil, a vaccine that's given to children to protect them from a disease they've got less than a 1/100th% chance of ever encountering in their life. And there's now evidence surfacing that the epidemic of peanut anaphylaxis, which can be fatal, if you have that and you're exposed to anything with peanuts in it, you can die. That's why a lot of products will say this product packaged on machinery that handles peanuts, because even just a little tiny piece of dust will provoke that intense immune reaction that can be fatal. And there's a growing body of evidence that the reason all of a sudden this peanut anaphylaxis, which is a brand new out of thin air illness, you don't go back to the 1800s and you don't find any records of people dropping dead from eating a peanut. And now they think it's because peanut oil is used as an adjuvant in vaccines. Now, peanut oil is something that you have evolved to eat and digest, not have pumped into your blood veins through a needle. Now, what an adjuvant is supposed to do, when they give you the vaccine with what we hope is a weakened version of whatever illness it is you're being vaccinated against, they will deliberately put chemicals in there designed to provoke the immune response of your body. In other words, they're putting stuff in there that your body is going to say, I don't like. And the idea is that your body will, along with reacting to all the other adjuvants, will develop a reaction to the intended target of the vaccine. The problem is your body is now being programmed to react to very benign and innocent things as if they're a severe reaction, a severe infection, like peanut oil. And this whole vaccine business is operating like the traveling Wild West medicine show. They're selling medicine to healthy people. Doesn't mean they're healthy after it's all over, but that's the business model here. They run the wagon into the middle of the town. They crank down the backstage. They have a little show out there, and then the pitchman comes out and says, out there on the Great Plains, there's a scourge that is laying waste to the Native American population, and it's coming this way. And if you want to survive that scourge, you will buy a bottle of Dr. Mike's What's-It for only 10 cents, one thin dime. The townspeople turn over their dimes. They drink the bottle, which is usually water with pepper oil in it. And the pitchman goes away happy with his money, and the townspeople think they're immune from a disease that didn't exist in the first place, and everybody goes home happy, except it is a scam and a fraud. We seem to be back in that same mindset. Now, to give you an example of just what a moneymaker healthcare in the United States is, we have the most expensive medical care on earth, and it's something like 30th in overall quality. Our infant mortality rate is almost up to the level of a third world non-industrialized nation. The rate at which newborn babies are dying in those hospitals is a scandal that nobody wants to talk about here. Heart surgery, which in the United States of America will cost $106,000, can be had in India for $1,500. Let me give you those numbers again. If you get this particular form of heart surgery in the United States, it'll cost you or your insurance company $106,000. If you have this same surgery in India, $1,500. Remember the big stink about everybody who was going up to Canada to buy inexpensive prescription medications at the Canadian pharmacies, and the U.S. government passed laws against it saying we can't be sure that the medications sold in those Canadian pharmacies are really as safe and efficacious as the ones in the American pharmacies. And then, of course, it turned out both the Canadian and the American pharmacies were getting their medications from the same manufacturers in Asia. It's all about protecting profit, forcing you to be dependent on American pharmacies, American pharmaceutical companies. American doctors don't want you going someplace where you can get the same care for less money. Prior to that law, I mean, there was literally pharmacy tourism. People living near the Canadian border, they'd get on a bus, drive on up, get their prescription meds, come on back. Down along the border to Mexico is dental tourism, because you can go into Mexico and get some first-rate dental treatment for pennies on the dollar compared to the U.S. Why is it so expensive here in the U.S.? Well, malpractice insurance, regulatory paperwork. There's so much gratuitous paperwork in the medical industry. Doctors spend more time filling out government forms than they are seeing actual patients. Everybody's out there to make a fast buck, hugely profitable. And I remember the last time that my wife had to go see an Orthodox doctor. She had a minor complaint. We even knew what it was and what the doctor had to give her. And we went in. Our regular doctor had gone on vacation. And so our insurance company said, you're going to have to take her down to blah. So we took her down to blah. And the doctor came in. We said, this is what's wrong with her. This is what she needs. The doctor said, you're right. That's what's wrong with her. This is what she needs. They gave it. Gone. $900 bill. And the insurance wouldn't cover it out of a technicality. Let's see. Johns Hopkins did a malpractice study and said that within their own hospital system, not on the national level, just within their own hospital system, there were over 4,000 surgical mistakes per year, leaving things inside the body like a sponge. They found out that the wrong procedure was done on a patient as much as 20 times a week, operating on the wrong location on the body. It's a factory. Get them in, cut them, stitch them up, send them the bill. The ideal, the spiritual ideal of the medical profession, to be a healer, to keep people healthy, to first of all do no harm, has gone away. Because it's all commercial. It's a money-making venture. And it gets back to what I've said before. I've got nothing against making money. But for society as a whole to be healthy, there have to be other priorities. Quality in your work, whatever that work is, whether it's a medical doctor or laying roads. And our society is very much out of balance. All righty, let's see. When we come back, as we head into the third hour with Kevin Annett, we're going to be going back and talking about the fracking scandal a little bit longer. And aloha, America. Welcome back to the show here as we're heading up to the top of the hour and our interview with Kevin Annett. Dan the Man is now in our control room taking care of the all them buttons and switches and dials out there and answering the phone when you call on in. Now, we've been talking over the last several weeks about the problems with fracking. This is a technique developed by the natural gas industry to drill down into various rock formations with lots of little tiny pockets of natural gas, methane, trapped in them, pumping down this fracking fluid, which is a highly toxic material that is designed to basically dissolve and break up the rock so that the little tiny pockets of natural gas become one giant pocket of natural gas that can be harvested. So far, so good. The problem is that the money junkies in this industry have been cutting corners. And far from the propaganda being put out that all of this is safe, that the wells are lined with concrete and there's an inner sleeve and we've got super seals and everything, it is starting to look like in their haste to harvest this gas from these shale formations, that they have created a major environmental problem. Now, there are a couple of documentaries out there, Gasland and Gasland Part 2, a lot of videos on YouTube where people are all of a sudden discovering that their drinking water tastes funny, is loaded with chemicals from the fracking fluid, and in worse cases, there's enough methane in their drinking water where you can set fire to it. And the gas industry has come back saying, oh, it's just fear-mongering. Go worry about the carbon dioxide and leave us methane people alone. And somebody just came up with a very interesting way of documenting what's going along and just how safe these wells are. And the article is called Drilling Air Pollution. We have it linked to the front page of whatreallyhappened.com. And it relies on the fact that in the visible spectrum of light, methane is invisible. It's one of the things that makes it very dangerous for miners. That's why old coal miners used to take canaries in a cage down into the coal mine, because birds are more susceptible to methane poisoning than humans. If the canary stopped singing, you got the heck out of there. Methane is odorless, colorless, and tasteless. When it's sold into your home as natural gas, they have to actually add that stinky smell so that you know there's a leak and you know you need to do something about it before you become overwhelmed. But in the infrared spectrum, Methane is quite dark. It's quite opaque. I remember one of the first times I got to play with an infrared scanner, and I was just scanning it around the room, and anybody in the room who was trying to covertly pass gas, it was instantly obvious. There was this black cloud that came out of the rear of their trousers and wafted up to the ceiling fans. And so somebody's taken the same technology, and they're taking video of these natural gas fracking operations, and they are seeing quite clearly massive amounts of methane are leaking out of these facilities up into the atmosphere. Now, the good news is, pardon me, that in the presence of free oxygen, methane will degrade into water vapor and carbon dioxide. Now, the bad news is, though, that any methane that has not yet decomposed, I mean, it can do it very rapidly. That's what the burning process does. Absent that kind of temperature, it's a more drawn-out, long process to do that. And the methane floating in the atmosphere can kill the birds in the atmosphere just as quickly as it can down in a coal mine. And we were reporting last week on all these sudden fish kills that are being reported all across the country, where somebody will go down to the old fishing hole and all the fish are dead lying on the surface, and the scientists will come in and say, oh, well, there's no oxygen left in the water. Golly gee, I wonder where it went. Well, again, if some of that methane is bubbling up from the fracking operations down below into those bodies of water, it'll combine with free oxygen dissolved in the water to produce more water molecules and carbon dioxide, which will bubble up out into the atmosphere. But in doing so, it depletes the oxygen, leading to these major fish deaths. And the gas industry is saying the wells are safe, they're perfectly sealed, there is no leakage, and the infrared video is showing quite the contrary, that these things are leaking like crazy. And you would think the gas companies would want to seal it all up because that gas that's leaking away is sellable product. But some money junkie, I'm sure, is doing a little calculation saying we're losing only $2 worth of methane by letting it leak, and it would cost us $400 to fix the problem, so the bottom line is we let it go on leaking. And it's another reminder that science in the hands of ordinary citizens can find out what's really going on. Because as we saw with that earlier story about GMO, these corporations don't want to spend the money to actually fix the problem. They see it as far cheaper to hire the spin doctors to come on out and say, really, it's overblown. You've got nothing to worry about. Remember after Fukushima when Ann Coulter was on the air saying, you know, a little radiation's actually good for you. I didn't see Ann Coulter volunteering to go over to Fukushima and help clean up that mess. Speaking of which, apparently there are continuing signs that something is going horribly wrong in Fukushima, specifically reactor number 3. These are all supposed to be in cold shutdown, but apparently there are pools of boiling water visible inside and just outside reactor unit number 3. I think it was 2 weeks ago we were reporting on the cesium-137 levels were increasing around that building. And I think the conclusion here is obvious. Somewhere down in the ground, underneath Fukushima reactor number 3, some of that radioactive slag from the fuel rods has pooled together in a configuration where it's beginning to spontaneously fission and produce more toxic byproducts. Not a thing they can do about it. Now, getting over to the Hanford facility here in the United States of America, somebody did a survey and discovered that the per capita incidence of birth defects has increased around that leaking nuclear facility. The official story is it's just a coincidence that we're leaking radioactivity and all the people living right in the area are all of a sudden having babies with 6 hands and 2 heads and 14 noses. It's just a coincidence, really. What are you, some kind of a wacko tinfoil hat-wearing conspiracy kook? The very idea that radiation would cause mutation, it's absurd. And, of course, over in Japan, they've actually set up websites where people are trading pictures of vegetables they find in their garden around Fukushima that are in these strange, bizarre shapes. It's a hobby now. Oh, look, I've got a tomato that's shaped like the Playmate Center of the Month. Let's put a photo on the website here. And I remember when I was a kid, and I used to do a lot of business with Edmund Scientific, and they had a lot of cool stuff back then. And this one time, they actually had flower seeds that had been intentionally exposed to radiation to trigger mutations. So you'd plant them and you wouldn't know what you're going to get. And hopefully it wouldn't crawl in the window and attack you in the middle of the night. Unfortunately, the seeds I got refused to germinate. They'd been exposed to too much radiation. We're going to grab a quick phone call here. Rick in Vancouver. Aloha, Rick. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Hi, Mike. I think you're forgetting a little bit of your high school chemistry there. Methane is not toxic. The main danger is that it's explosive.
Well, it's toxic in the sense that it can displace the oxygen, and by the time you realize that you're starting to come down with hypoxia, it's way too late. It's like a nitrogen accident in a laboratory. The way our bodies are set up, you feel out of breath based on the amount of carbon dioxide in your blood, not the amount of oxygen. And if you're still exhaling and getting rid of the carbon dioxide, you feel completely fine until all of a sudden your brain starts shutting down because you don't have any oxygen. So in that regard, it's considered a toxic risk or a hazardous risk.
Well, the canary in the coal mine wasn't for methane, though, of course.
What was it for?
It was for, I can't remember the other gas, but you know, a gas that actually will kill you in breathing it. It might have been H2S or something like that.
Well, they don't need a canary for H2S because you smell that when it's there. If you're smelling hydrogen,
well, by the time you smell it, you're already dead.
Well, okay, we got to take a break for news and station identification. We'll be back with Kevin and America. Welcome back to our show here. And before we get to our on-air guest, just as a follow-up on that last phone call, the two gases which were a danger to coal miners were methane and carbon monoxide, both of them colorless, odorless, tasteless, both of them capable of killing the miners, and the birds would succumb far sooner, and that's why they took the canaries into the coal mine. They don't do that anymore. Now they've got electronic gas sensing equipment. But methane is not something you want to take lightly. It is a far worse greenhouse gas, far more potent than carbon dioxide. And as that infrared video of the drilling facilities, the fracking facilities shows, it's just pouring up into the atmosphere. But they want you to be worried about carbon dioxide because that they can blame on you to justify a carbon tax. Not going to tax the methane. That's mostly produced by deep crust microbes who are far too intelligent life forms to fall for Al Gore and his nonsense. Joining us on the air now is Kevin Annett. And Kevin, welcome back to the show. I know I had you on the show way back. You've been working on this problem for a long time. Would you please just sort of start from the beginning and give our listeners an overview of this horrible scandal involving the residence schools?
Thanks, Mike. I appreciate being on again. Well, it goes back 20 years for me when I began to encounter this as a clergyman on the west coast of Canada. In a nutshell, there was a whole plan, both in Canada and the United States, to basically exterminate whole areas of the country of the Aboriginal population using these so-called Indian residential schools. After a lot of work, we finally forced the government to acknowledge a bunch of stuff, including that there was a deliberate plan to infect a lot of young kids with smallpox and tuberculosis and then let them die off. We've documented a lot of this online at hiddennolonger.com. And over the last few years, this campaign has grown internationally now so that we're actually working with groups in a number of different countries, documenting the same kind of crimes. And we're at the point now where we're actually charging those responsible in international common law courts that we've helped to set up. These include the Queen of England, the Crown of England, the Pope in Rome, of course. The Catholic Church was a main instigator in a lot of these facilities. And I think, what I often say to people is, these crimes weren't just in the past. These are ongoing kinds of crimes of genocide. And we've been able to document some of them, but there's a concerted campaign continually by government and churches to continue to bury this stuff, silence the witnesses, and that kind of thing. But fortunately, we're bringing this stuff out more, and there's a website of our tribunal, the International Tribunal into Crimes of Church and State, and it's at itccs.org.
Could you repeat that one again for me, please?
It's www.itccs.org.
Okay. I'm going to put a link to both these websites up there. Actually, not to put a wrinkle in your presentation, but I'm getting a server error over at hiddennolonger.com. So you may want to have your webmaster take a quick look at that. Maybe it's just overwhelmed from people trying to log into that.
Yeah, I'll check it out.
Okay, so one of the reasons I wanted to call you and have you on the show right now is apparently there was a decision handed down by a high court in Canada forcing or compelling the Canadian government to release all this documentation. Apparently the Canadian government had said, oh, it's too expensive, it doesn't matter anymore, the usual dodge tactics that we see. And what's the latest word on that particular aspect?
Well, really what's happened with that is the Supreme Court in Ontario has ordered the government to release documents about the residential schools to another wing of government. You see, the government and church has set up this thing called the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, but it's under the control of the Prime Minister's office. So it's kind of, the way the left hand just passes to the right various documents and calls that disclosure, but this Truth and Reconciliation Commission is not allowed to disclose anything that might compromise the Crown or these churches. So it's really an empty gesture. And these documents involve experiments that were done on Native children in these Indian hospitals, which caused the deaths of many of them. So obviously they don't want a lot of that truth coming out. But, they spin it to make it sound like they're disclosing stuff. In practice, the courts in Canada have continually refused to allow evidence into the public record about these experiments and the massive death rates of really over half these children. Over 50,000 children never came back. And so this is one of the reasons we were compelled to go through a common law court process.
Well, it's a very shocking situation, and I noticed and I pointed out when the article came out about the court's decision, the article was written to basically make it look like this was all completely the Canadian government. They had funded the schools. There was no mention of the fact that these schools were being run by religious institutions. And it seemed like somebody pulled some strings there to sort of have that little aspect of it left out. Now, I understand when you first started to go public with this, you came under a great deal of abuse from your own particular church. If you'd like to sort of recount that little story for us.
Well, definitely. Like just on your first point, there's been a campaign all along to cover the church's role, completely conceal it, because they were the main instigators of this. The churches are never mentioned in the media, which is absurd because they set up these places. They forced the government to keep them open right up to the 1990s. So to leave them out is just complete miscarriage of justice. But in terms of what happened to me, I was in early 1995 when I was fired from my pulpit without due process or anything after I began to point out and give voice to some of the witnesses to these murders in the United Church residential schools. It was a complete campaign of attack. They helped my wife divorce me. They helped her there was a whole campaign of public discrediting. They prevented me from completing my university degree when I was trying to retrain. There was a complete campaign in the media to discredit all the work that we were bringing out, even though later on they, in fact, acknowledged a lot of the stuff that we had brought out, the eyewitnesses. On that website, hiddennolonger.com, which actually I just got up, by the way, it seems to be operating in my end, okay. You can see a lot of the testimonies of people. Recently, we just posted 150 exhibits, videotaped testimonies of people describing burying children, witnessing killings. All of that is up at itccs.org. And up in the masthead, you'll see one of the titles is ICLCJ for International Common Law Court of Justice. If you go on there, it's 4.5 hours of testimonies and documentation of all this stuff. So it's not like they can deny this stuff anymore. They can just completely try to discredit the source, which is what they've been trying to do from the beginning with me.
Well, again, I understand. I think it was even Harper himself who said, really, it's costing too much, and it just happened so long ago, and nobody really cares. But as you say, these abuses continued into the 1990s. That's recent history. It's certainly far more current affairs than this constant caterwauling about what happened in Germany in the 1930s and 1940s. And I have to be honest, I had forgotten about the fact that these kids were being used for human medical experiments. I knew there was a lot of physical abuse and sexual abuse, and I knew there'd been a lot of deaths, but I had absolutely lost track of the fact that a lot of the deaths resulted from these kids being used as human test subjects. And
well, right down the road, yeah, 2 miles from where I'm sitting, there was a thing called the Nanaimo Indian Hospital, where they were conducting mass sterilizations against any natives who wouldn't get off their land, who wouldn't learn English. The church has often had a policy that if the family didn't come to church and were doing their traditional practices, they would automatically get sterilized. And that's been documented. There have been lawsuits in Canada about that already. There was sterilization laws allowing that to happen. I mean, all the evidence is there. So it was out-and-out genocide for sure. And, the effects of it continue very much today in Aboriginal families. A lot of these people I work with, they still suffer an enormous high death rate because of the effects of all of these things.
And let me ask you the big question here. Were these religious institutions answering to some other authority, or this is just what they decided policy was going to be?
No, it was definitely the origin of these Indian boarding schools in both the U.S. and Canada were the Jesuits. They set up, the Jesuit order had a whole plan of, kind of going in, wiping out the tradition.
We got to take a break for commercials, Kevin. Okay. I'm sorry to cut you off. We'll be back in 3 minutes. America, welcome back to the show. We're talking with Kevin Annett about the abuses of Canada's residential schools for Indigenous, meaning Native Canadian, children. And it's just an horrific story. It is recent history. The schools were still open until the 1990s. And we've got the Government of Canada, the Catholic Church of Canada, the Anglican Church of Canada, just working to try and suppress these horrific things that were done to these kids, including forced sterilization against their will and medical experiments without informed consent. And Kevin, you were starting to talk about how all of this was really leading up to the Jesuits imposing some kind of a genocidal policy on the North American continent.
Well, yeah, that's been proven historically. The Jesuits set up the models for these schools as a mechanism to wipe out any non-Catholic native group. And it's interesting, the present Pope, Jorge Bergoglio, is himself the first Jesuit in history to occupy that position. And he himself has been served documents recently because of his complicity in helping conceal a lot of this stuff. And, of course, the astounding statement he made the other day when he actually said it's a crime to report child abuse. And if you report child abuse in the church, you can be put in a Vatican prison. It shows you this cover-up and these crimes carry on very much today.
Well, the crimes are coming out, and, for the Catholic Church to basically be using on their own people the same kind of tactics we're seeing the U.S. government use on people like Bradley Manning and Edward Snowden. If you tell our dirty little secrets, we will do bad things to you. It sounds like the Inquisition is coming back, or whatever they call it these days, the Institute for... there's a new name for the Inquisition. Pope Benny the Rat was in charge of it before he became Pope.
That's right. A Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith.
That is it. The Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. And my own ancestors fell victim to their administration back in the 1490s. If it wasn't for the Inquisition, I would have been a rich Hollywood Jew today.
Well, exactly. My ancestors were Huguenots in France. We had to flee to England because of this persecution. So this is what we're saying, that the genocide wasn't confined just to Native people. It was really at the hands of anyone who wasn't, part of that system. And there's a lot of Americans today who are descended from refugees from this kind of religious terror.
Well, it almost seems like this is a major part of the history of the church, and I know a lot of it goes back to Pope Alexander VI, who was a really wild party animal. But he signed this treaty, the Treaty of Tordesillas, I think it was pronounced. I'll have to go back and double-check that, where he basically told Spain and Portugal that you have God's blessing to go out and force all of the countries you encounter to be Catholic, because if they're not Catholic, they're not real countries, and that gives you the authority to invade and conquer and take over. And it seems like they've been following that policy right up into the modern era.
Well, very much. In fact, it wasn't just starting with that pope. It goes back even almost 1,000 years before him, where, for example, in Ireland, in the 12th century, Pope Adrian said that the Irish had lost the right to their own land because they had to become good Catholics. So he authorized Henry II of England to invade and conquer the Irish in 1172. So, it's the same logic. They believe the Pope is above all laws. He owns the world and can give anything to anyone he likes. It's really that attitude. People don't seem to realize that they still hold to that belief system.
Well, my goodness. It's a very sorry story, and I think at this particular point in time, we're going to see the public at large willing to actually look at these kinds of abuses. And I know as early as 30 years ago, in the general population, to go around and say that people hiding behind these white robes have very black hearts and are doing these kinds of things. Oh, no. These are all men and women of God. They're holy. They're doing all this charitable work. And yes, there was the witch burnings and the Inquisition, but that was so long ago and really couldn't happen today. And then we keep finding out it does happen today. I know that as late as 1995, there were still burning of witches down in South America. And I think because of the exposures regarding the rampant child sexual molestation by many religions, not just the Catholics, but by many religions, people are beginning to see what's really going on inside this institutionalized, corporatized marketing of religion. And again, I want to draw a big black line here between individual people who have certain religious beliefs they want to follow and these large financial organizations that are exploiting those beliefs for financial gain, for conquest, whether it's the Crusades. You know, if you go out and kill the Saracens and give us their land, you will get into heaven no matter what you did as a sin. And it's very ugly. And the revelation that these practices have continued into the modern era, I think more people are willing to recognize that, yes, that's really going on. There was an amazing HBO documentary called Max Mea Culpa, Silence in the House of God, about molestation in a church-operated home for the deaf, where these kids couldn't tell anybody what was going on because their parents didn't know sign language. And a lot of people watched it. And because of that, I think it's time for a documentary on the resident schools.
Well, you know, the reality, Mike, is that the reason that can go on is there's laws in place. There's a law that most people don't know about. It's called Crimen Solicitatis, and it orders every priest and bishop in the world to cover up child rape or they'll be excommunicated. To stay in the church as a clergyman, you have to collude in a crime. You have to protect child rapists or you're out of a job. You're out of the church. And so that should not be allowed to be. Why does any government allow that church to operate under a law that basically says you've got to protect a child rapist? Those laws have got to be revoked. You know, that there's got to be one law for everybody. And that's the problem in these situations, is that the church is a law unto itself and governments collude in that.
Well, the governments are willing to collude in these kinds of abuses because churches are part of the system of control that governments use to keep the people in their place. You know, render unto Caesar, you know, don't stand up and fight against your betters or you're going to go to the dark regions. And don't worry, it doesn't matter how much the money junkies abuse you in this life, in the next life, they're going to be sent to the dark regions and you get wings and a harp, which is kind of a raw deal because I play banjo. But I mean, that's this sort of dark partnership between church and state united against ordinary people. And it has led to these hideous and ugly abuses because certainly in the case of the resident schools, you have the government of Canada hand in glove with these religious institutions committing what really has to be described as genocide against these children.
Absolutely. And, you know, not one person has ever gone to trial in Canada for the death of one of these children. It has been a complete miscarriage of justice. They gave out a little bit of money and said, gee, we're sorry. And you can count on one hand the number of people who have ever gone to jail for these crimes. I mean, imagine if 50,000 children in America were wiped out. Would there be any prison sentences? Would there be a criminal investigation? In this case, no, because it's the churches and government that are still in charge. So, you know, this is why we've had to go outside Canada. You can't even talk about this stuff anymore publicly without being shut down. You know, so it's one of the reasons I like coming down to the States to talk about this is because, at least in America, you know, you have some tradition of being able to criticize the government, and people tend to not flinch when you criticize the church or the government like they do in Canada. So, you know, it's a real uphill battle, but the truth is coming out more and more, like you say.
Well, unfortunately, here in the United States of America, we're starting to see the government attempt to crack down on people who speak out about abuses They're shredding our Bill of Rights, including the First Amendment. Kevin, we've got a 4-minute break here. When you come back, I'd like you to tell us where are you speaking in the United States and anything else you want to share with our listeners. We'll be right back. Welcome back to the show. We're talking with Kevin Annett, and it's just this horrible story of just how dark government and religion can truly be. And we're talking about abuses that were not confined just to Canada. We saw a lot of it here in the United States. It's just up in Canada. It continued into the 1990s. We know there's been more scandals here in the U.S. about forced sterilizations and compensation to those people. But how do you compensate somebody where you've taken away their ability to have their own child? There really is no way to remedy that situation. Say, yes, you can adopt. Yeah, we can, but we wanted our own. It's a very powerful, primal instinct to want to have your own children. And to just arbitrarily take that away from somebody because they don't believe in the same imaginary playmate in the sky that you do, it truly is a crime against humanity. Yeah. So, Kevin,
Go ahead. I'm just the crime of sterilization is that it's in a direct attack at the next generation, at the family. People don't recover from this. I've worked with survivors of these things, and there's a shame and a horrible destruction that occurs because of that. And what we have to realize is that program of depopulation and sterilization is continuing. It's operating within the so-called public health system now, the vaccination programs. These are going on aimed at especially low-income white folks. I mean, I've worked with people in Vancouver who were told by the social welfare agencies that they're going to have to be sterilized or they'll stop receiving benefits. And, so this is an ongoing kind of program. And this is why we're saying today this campaign has to continue, and we have to do it in a way where the evidence is brought out in our own common law courts, because these other courts are compromised and corrupt, and they refuse to even address these issues.
Yeah, that's getting to be a problem. Here in the United States, the court system absolutely cannot be trusted to be impartial, certainly on areas involving government crime, certainly on areas involving, like the Bradley Manning trial. I mean, that was a kangaroo court right from the get-go. We have this Foreign Intelligence Service Court, which supposedly only has jurisdiction outside the United States of America, now saying that they can declare it legal for the National Security Agency to violate the Bill of Rights for law-abiding American citizens, and it is completely out of control. You mentioned that you do come down to the United States to talk about this a lot, because in Canada you're not allowed to talk about this at all, that they'll come down on you like the ton of proverbial bricks. Do you have any upcoming speaking engagements that you'd like to share with our listeners?
Yeah, as a matter of fact, Mike, in September I'm starting a speaking tour in the U.S. It's going to be combined with going over briefly to Europe and working with groups there. But starting in first week of September, I'll be in New York City. And I'm working actively with groups on the East Coast and in the southern states especially, who are trying to set up common law courts to look at other issues, attacks, the kinds of things that you've been mentioning, attacks on civil liberties and the Constitution and that. So there's even groups of sheriffs and the Oath Keepers who are coming forward to try to help us in our work, because they recognize these are kind of ongoing crimes. So I'll be in New York in the first week of September, and then after that I'm planning to work west. So if people want to get a hold of me and help set up meetings, you can write to me, hiddenfromhistory1, which is like the number 1, hiddenfromhistory1 @gmail.com. And please see our website of all the news at www.itccs.org.
All right. Is there anything else you want to share with our listeners just in closing?
I would say that, the importance of this campaign now to expose the crimes of the churches is that it's increasing. There's, for the first time in American history, there was actually a Catholic bishop went to jail last year for helping to traffic children. They found that in Philadelphia, over a quarter of all Catholic priests were involved in actively trafficking children, if you can believe it. These are crimes that are going on right now, and the children in every community are threatened by this. So I would say to people, get involved for the sake of your own children and the future of humanity, really. Share our work and our evidence and contact me. Again, it's itccs.org, and we have about 8 groups now operating in the United States that are working actively with us. So please contact us. All
righty. Well, in closing, before I let you go, I was given a religious upbringing. I was raised congregational. It didn't stick. But I still have the Bible they gave me for singing in the choir, and it still has that little bookmark in it with the 10 Commandments on there. And I remember one of them says, "Thou shalt not kill." And to just hear these stories of these religious institutions using these indigenous children for medical experiments that led to their death, how do they reconcile that? Or they just don't really care, or they simply see anybody who's not Catholic as Untermenschen. They're not really humans, therefore it's not really a sin. We've seen that attitude professed. But for me, back when I was religious, I was kind of an absolutist about that. Thou shalt not kill means thou shalt not kill anybody. And
well, that's right, and I think that's why these so-called churches have lost the right to operate. They do not operate according to their professed faith. They violate that faith in the innocent. And I have seen no idea why these institutions have to be supported by taxpayers' money and other government subsidies. It's a crime against humanity to do that, to fund murderous organizations like that. So, people have to, I think, vote with their feet and their dollars on this issue as well.
I would absolutely agree, and the time for outrage is now. And again, because of these revelations and exposures and these documentaries coming out, I think people are waking up and realizing that these large institutions that control our lives, whether they're political or religious, are not even close to being what their public image says that they are. And that in point of fact, the downfall of organized religion is the same as that for organized politics. It's always going to attract the very sort of people who shouldn't be allowed to have that kind of power, who love to hide behind that wearable instant image of respectability and untouchability. And I remember reading stories about when the child sexual molestation was first beginning to surface, about how the attitude is, you can't say that about a priest. And that attitude is now gone. Yeah, you can say it about a priest because it is a major, major problem out there. And that religion, far from being a moral compass on which to base our lives, has very often been mutated into an excuse to engage in some very, very primitive, barbarous behavior.
Especially when there's a law in place that encourages child rape, that says child rape is to be not talked about. That's the official policy coming out of Rome now from this new pope, that it's criminalized. If you spill the beans about a child being raped, you can go to and stuck in a papal prison. That's the policy. So it's unconscionable.
Well, that's a policy, but it's not a law in the traditional sense of a law, because certainly here in the United States of America, the Constitution does not recognize an official church. And so the churches can make up whatever laws they want internally. I can make up laws in the office. Trash shall be emptied every Wednesday. Okay, but it is still subordinate to the civil law. And the civil law says you don't do these kinds of things. And the time has come to basically send in the SWAT teams that they're sending into homes because they think they might have a marijuana joint, and start sending these SWAT teams into these religious institutions that are engaging in these kinds of practices. It's time for the kid gloves to come off.
I agree. That's what we're trying to do.
All right. Well, Kevin, thank you very much. I want to have you back on the show after you're in your speaking tour in September, and just sort of get the latest update on this. But the idea that this lasted right into the 1990s, this is current events. This isn't something that happened back in the 1490s. It was the Inquisition, and yes, they make movies about it, and Mel Brooks sings songs about it. This is something that happened within recent memory of living people. And it is absolutely a scandal that the government of Canada and the Catholic Church of Canada and the Anglican Church of Canada have simply closed ranks and said, we did what we did, and now we just have to make sure nobody talks about it. That's a complete absence of responsibility for one's actions. It was the will of the imaginary playmate in the sky, therefore I can sleep at night. And I find it absolutely appalling. Kevin, thank you very much. We're going to let you go here. We're coming up on a commercial break. Phone lines are open. We've got one more segment in today's show. If you want to get on the air, 800-313-9443, 800-313-9443, and we will be back. Well, actually, I got another minute before the music starts. So let's get back on here to the news. We were talking about alternative energy. We're talking about the abuses of the fracking industry. We're talking about leaks around Hanford. and the escalation in the per capita rate of birth defects there. We're talking about how there's a social media phenomenon in Japan about mutated garden vegetables, and they're just putting the pictures up and say, ooh, look what I found in my garden today. I think now's the time to start looking seriously at thorium cycle reactors, because they are in existence, they do work, they are a much cleaner alternative, but everybody wants the reactors they can use to make bomb stuff. We'll be right back. And aloha, America. Welcome back to the show. A very appropriate piece of bump music. For those of you who are really wondering if these kinds of evils can happen in history, I suggest you get out your web search engine and you look for the history of the Ustashi, spelled Ustashi. This was a Catholic group that during World War II set up concentration camps in Croatia. And whereas Hollywood is always portraying these camps as only holding the Jews, these camps run by the Ustashi held non-Catholics who were treated so brutally by the Franciscans running these camps that the SS actually complained to Adolf Hitler, saying, these people make us look bad. The Ustashi, Ustashi. We're going to grab some phone calls here in our last segment. Danny in South Carolina. Aloha, Danny. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Aloha, Michael. Just a quick update. You mentioned earlier about Israel asking for a $5 billion advance.
Yes.
And they got me to thinking something's up here, so I checked on Senate Bill 462, the Enhanced Strategic Cooperation Act.
Yes.
Which expands on the same bill that they passed in 2012. Well, they now have the bill now has 50 co-sponsors, which means that they're probably pretty certain now that the bill is going to pass, which means they have right to demand not only $5 billion, but however much that they think they need to maintain this, quote, strategic edge, unquote.
Which is strange considering that Israel is the only nuclear-armed state in the region. And they've got such a wonderful arms industry inside Israel. They're one of the biggest arms exporters in the world, and yet they still come over to the U.S. Congress and say, make the American people pay to buy us more weapons because we're poor little victims and everybody hates us. And it's another scam. And the thing that's really dangerous about this bill is that it automatically commits the United States to enter any war that Israel is in on Israel's side, even if Israel starts the war. In other words, the Congress just ceded the constitutional authority to declare war on behalf of the American military forces to a foreign government.
Well, there it is, Michael. I mean, the gate's open now. You know, God help us. But I just wanted to let you know they got 50 co-sponsors now, so it looks like it's a shoo-in.
You know, it's amazing. You couldn't get Congress to agree on a key with which to whistle Dixie, but when it comes to Israel, unanimous bipartisan support. It is embarrassing and shameful and humiliating to the American people, and you should be very angry. In fact, at this stage in our history, now is the time you should be allowing your anger to come out.
I agree.
It's just reached that point. Remember what it says in the Declaration? People are disposed to suffer while evils are sufferable. Well, we're past that point. The evils are no longer sufferable. It's time to get seriously ticked off about it. Danny, got to let you go. Running out of time. We're going to switch over to Brendan in Wisconsin. Aloha, Brendan. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Aloha, Michael. Before I get to this quick story, I really like the way you signed off yesterday and encourage you. You always sign off with something positive and encouraging people to focus, find their specialty. I mean, that's everyone else compartmentalizes on the other side, and I thought that was a great way to sign off.
Thank you.
From time to time, I do a lot of truth seeker headline mining for a bunch of other shows and .coms, and many of whom I know listen to your show, and I wanted to send you this one. It was a story from a whistleblower about transcranial magnetic stimulation. It's a new program, or maybe not so new, out of Arizona State University. So if you look up TMS and ASU, and it's basically, you may not know that you're even being brainwashed, and they're working on ways to deliver it from afar. And it's one of the creepiest things that I've read. I read a lot of news stories, and that's one of the creepiest ones.
Well,
that
let
I've
me
seen
give you a little bit of the backstory on that. This technology was actually discovered by accident by kids in Japan who realized, microwaving your brain was dangerous, but by putting an oscillating magnetic field near your skull that you could stimulate certain parts of your brain. Now, it can't be done remotely because magnetic fields, unlike light or other radiation, which fall off as the inverse of the square of the distance, magnetic fields fall off as the cube. The inverse of the cube of the distance, and so magnetic fields really don't reach all that far. So it would have to be something that was built into a hat or a cap, and as far as being able to minutely control individual sections of the brain, the magnetic fields don't really control that well. So it's an interesting novelty, and it could even be potentially dangerous. I don't know how far Arizona is going to get with this, but I'm sure they got a lot of funding to study it, just like the CIA got funding for 9 years to run those sex and drug rooms up in San Francisco. You can come up with any harebrained scheme that might potentially produce a world-changing breakthrough, and DARPA just has a check that they'll just write you a check for.
Wow, you're all over it. I appreciate your knowledge of emerging technologies. That's something that a lot of other people lack. So thank you, Michael.
All right, you're welcome. We're going to switch over to Werner in New Brunswick. Aloha, Werner. Welcome to the show. What is on your mind today?
Good afternoon, Mike. I was listening earlier in the show about where you addressed the fracking issue.
Yes.
And I was very much glad that Kevin Annett was on your show.
Yes, he's an amazing gentleman.
It all feeds together. Right now, across Canada, Native people, they start taking a stand. They have a movement, Silent No More. And this is basically where they're fighting against the, in a non-violent way, fighting and resisting the takeover of big multinational corporations. Here, for example, in Eastern Canada, about the fracking issue. And I find it very much obscene that the RCMP, the very same organization that for over 100 years was involved in the genocide of the native people and was participating in, that now they are protecting those big multinational corporation here again.
Mm-hmm.
Their slogan is, to serve and protect the people of Canada. Their mandate is not to serve and protect big multinational corporations. But I guess they're living true to their nature, warrior.
Well, they're doing as they're told. They're doing as the people who sign their paychecks tell them to do. We're certainly seeing that here in the United States with these police who are taking away cameras from people who are photographing agricultural facilities now. They're taking away cameras from people who are photographing police abuse, even though the courts have ruled that people have a right to take pictures and videos of police. When they're out in public, they're not supposed to have an expectation of privacy, but the rule of law is rapidly vanishing here. And Werner, I'm going to let you go because we're almost at the end of the show. And I just want to finish up, along with the idea that now's the time to get angry. We all need to go on speaking out about the things that are going wrong for a very fundamental reason. We need to make it socially acceptable for the general population to stand up and say, this government isn't playing by the rules. They're not abiding by the Constitution. They are now illegitimate. And that is an idea that we need to basically have spread across the United States of America, that the federal government is not legal. It's not following the law. It's not following the Constitutional. They're just throwing their weight around and trying to bluff you back into obedience, whether it's staging race riots or Obama out there saying, if you'll forget about all the scandals, I promise to rig the economic reports to make things look better. But the time has come for every single American citizen to stand up and say, I am not part of this system anymore. This is not my government. And I refuse to listen to them anymore. I refuse to fill out their paperwork. I refuse to pay their bills. I certainly refuse to sacrifice the life of my child in this illegal government's wars of conquest to make the money junkies richer than they already are. We have to make it socially acceptable to be critical of the government. Because remember that whole political correctness movement of the 1990s? Where they were trying to sell you the idea that you're not supposed to criticize the government any more than you're supposed to criticize the clergy for when they're diddling the little boys in the choir loft. And that kind of brainwashing has to go away. And we have to say, yeah, ordinary Americans, law-abiding Americans have a right and a duty to stand up and say, this government has broken itself. We're going to be back here tomorrow on the Republic Broadcasting Network. Ellen Brown will be our guest in the third hour. Until then, stay safe, stay skeptical, stay angry, stay informed, make good choices. Please support Republic Broadcasting. We're in a period of immense growth. We need financial assistance. We need new affiliates. Call your local AM and FM stations. Let them know we're out here. And aloha, America.